The desperate playth, crystalline spires of the Zephyrian capital caught the light of 3 suns as Ambassador Thylos hurried through the corridors of the Grand Assembly. His translucent wings, usually a sign of his species' calm demeanor, flickered, with patterns of deep crimson that betrayed his distress. The emergency session had been called with unprecedented urgency, and representatives from 47 peaceful civilizations were gathering in the Great Chamber. The Zephyrians had evolved on a world of gentle breezes and floating continents, where cooperation and harmony were not just ideals but survival necessities. Their society, like most in the galactic harmony, had long ago abandoned the primitive concept of warfare. Violence was considered a relic of lesser evolved species, something to be studied in historical archives rather than practiced. Thylos entered the assembly chamber, where holographic projections of various species flickered to life. The Aquari floated in their water-filled environmental suits, their tentacles weaving complex patterns of greeting. The silicon-based crystallites hummed in frequencies that translated to concern. The energy beings known as the Luminae pulsed, with anxious colors. All had gathered because the impossible had happened. War had returned to their galaxy. The chamber fell silent as Thylos took the central platform. His voice, translated through the universal communication network, carried the weight of impending doom. The Vorthan swarm had emerged from the void between galaxies 3 cycles ago. They were unlike anything the galactic harmony had encountered, where the member species had evolved beyond violence through enlightenment. The Vorthans had evolved through it, becoming perfect killing machines that consumed entire worlds to fuel their endless expansion. The holographic display showed the devastation. 12 systems had already fallen. The garden world of Serapha, with its billion-year-old forests, was now a barren rock. The crystal cities of Nexus Prime had been shattered and harvested for minerals. The Vorthans didn't conquer or enslave. They consumed everything, leaving nothing but empty space in their wake. Minister Corinth of the Aquari spoke first, her translated words rippling through the water of her suit. Our combined peace fleets were destroyed in minutes. The Vorthans adapt to every defensive measure we deploy. Our shield harmonics, our diplomatic protocols, even our attempts at communication are met with nothing but hunger and violence. The discussion that followed was one of desperation. The galactic harmony had no military doctrine, no weapons of war, no understanding of tactical combat. Their ships were designed for exploration and trade. Their defensive systems meant only for asteroid deflection and radiation shielding. They were sheep who had forgotten that wolves existed, and now the wolves were at their door. It was Elder Zix of the Crystallites who proposed the unthinkable. During their long-range monitoring of primitive systems, they had detected something unusual in a distant spiral arm. A small yellow star hosted a world that their sensors classified as a Class 9 death world. The gravity was crushing by most standards. The atmosphere filled with corrosive oxygen, the surface plagued by tectonic instability, violent storms, and temperature extremes that would kill most sentient species within hours. Yet somehow, impossibly, intelligent life had not only survived, but thrived there. The inhabitants called their world Earth, and themselves humans. The Crystallites' data showed a species that had spent its entire existence in conflict. Their history was written in blood and warfare, from primitive tribal conflicts to global wars that had nearly ended their civilization multiple times. They had split the atom not for energy, but for weapons. They had reached space not through cooperation, but through competition between rival nations. The assembly recoiled at the data. These humans were everything the galactic harmony had evolved beyond. They still fought wars, still maintained massive military forces, still developed new weapons despite having no external threats. They were primitive, violent, and dangerous. They were also possibly the only hope for survival. Ambassador Thylos volunteered to make contact. If the humans refused or proved hostile, the Harmony would lose nothing that wasn't already doomed. If they agreed to help, perhaps their primitive violence could be directed against the Vorthons. The journey to Earth took 7 cycles through hyperspace, giving Thylos time to study human culture and language through intercepted transmissions. What he learned both horrified and fascinated him. Humans had a concept called total war, where entire civilizations mobilized for conflict. They had developed weapons that could crack continents and poisons that could kill entire ecosystems. They had fought wars over resources, ideology, religion, and sometimes for no clear reason at all. Yet they also showed remarkable adaptability and ingenuity, turning their hostile world's challenges into strengths. The approach to Earth was tense. Thylos's ship, the Harmony's voice, was a work of art by Zephyrian standards, its crystalline hull designed for beauty and efficiency. As it entered Earth's solar system, it was immediately detected by arrays of sensors and weapons platforms. That shouldn't have existed for a species that had only recently achieved spaceflight. Humanity had militarized their entire system with a thoroughness that spoke of deep paranoia or preparation. The first contact came not through diplomatic channels, but through targeting locks. Dozens of weapon systems focused on the Harmony's voice, each one capable of delivering destruction in ways the Zephyrians had never imagined. The humans didn't send greetings or queries. They sent warnings and demands for identification, their messages carrying an undertone of barely restrained violence. Thylos transmitted the mathematical sequences that were standard for first contact. Protocols, followed by a message of peace and a request for dialogue. The response was swift and unexpected. Instead of diplomats or scientists, the humans sent what they called a joint military commission to the meeting point near their moon. The human vessels that arrived were angular and utilitarian, built for function over form, bristling with weapons that seemed excessive for a species with no known enemies. The human who led the Yami delegation introduced himself as General Harrison, a man whose bearing spoke of a lifetime of conflict. His eyes, when they looked at Thylos, carried an assessment that was both tactical and strategic. The translator struggled with the nuances of his speech, the underlying assumptions of violence that colored even peaceful conversation. When Thylos explained the situation, showing the destruction wrought by the Vorthons, he expected shock or fear. Instead, General Harrison and his staff exchanged looks that the translator identified as professional interest. They asked questions not about the Vorthons' motivations or the possibility of peace, but about their tactics, their technology, their weaknesses. The humans viewed the footage of destroyed worlds with a clinical detachment that chilled Thylos. They discussed engagement ranges, weapon yields, and force multipliers as if planning a training exercise rather than confronting an existential threat. When Thylos mentioned that the Galactic Harmony had no weapons capable of stopping the Vorthons, General Harrison's response was a small smile that somehow conveyed both amusement and predatory anticipation. The general explained that humanity had been preparing for something like this since they first looked at the stars. Every human child grew up with stories of alien invasion, of humanity standing against impossible odds. Their entire military doctrine had evolved around the assumption that someday something hostile would come from the void. They had weapons, designed to fight enemies they had only imagined, strategies developed for threats that existed only in theory. What Thylos had thought would be a desperate plea for help from a primitive species became something else entirely. The humans weren't considering whether to help. They were calculating how quickly they could mobilize, how many ships they could deploy, how much destruction they could bring to bear. The prospect of fighting an existential threat didn't frighten them. It excited them. As the meeting concluded, General Harrison made a comment that would haunt Thylos. The humans said that the Galactic Harmony was lucky the Vorthons had attacked first. If humanity had discovered a galaxy full of peaceful, defenseless civilizations on their own, the temptation to conquer might have been overwhelming. But now, they had a legitimate enemy to fight, a reason to unleash the weapons they had been building for generations. The preparations began immediately. Humanity didn't just mobilize their existing forces. They activated reserves, converted civilian ships to military use, and began mass production of weapons that had existed only as prototypes. The entire species shifted into what they called a war economy with an efficiency that suggested this was not their first time. Asterisk. The unleashed storm within 3 Earth weeks, humanity had assembled a fleet that defied Zephyrian comprehension. The ships were not elegant or beautiful. They were instruments of destruction, designed with a single purpose. The flagship, which the humans had named Nemesis, was a kilometer-long vessel that seemed to be built around its main weapon, something the humans called a relativistic kill vehicle launcher. Admiral Chun, who commanded the fleet, briefed Thylos on human military doctrine as they prepared to jump to Zephyrian space. She explained concepts that had no equivalent in the Harmony's language: shock and awe, force multiplication, mutual assured destruction. The humans had spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare, developing philosophies of conflict that treated violence as both science and art. The fleet that jumped into Zephyrian space consisted of 43 capital ships, over 200 escorts, and thousands of smaller craft the humans called fighters. Each vessel carried weapons that violated several galactic harmony treaties on prohibited technologies. Antimatter warheads, quantum destabilizers, directed energy weapons that could punch through planetary shields. The humans had developed these, not for any specific enemy, but because they could, because not having them would mean vulnerability. The Vorthan swarm was besieging the Zephyrian homeworld when the human fleet arrived. The enemy had never encountered organized resistance, only the panicked flight of peaceful species. They had grown complacent in their consumption, spreading their forces thin to harvest maximum resources. It was a fatal mistake. Admiral Chun didn't announce their arrival or attempt communication. The first sign the Vorthans had of human presence was when relativistic projectiles traveling at 90% the speed of light tore through their harvest ships. The weapons were invisible until impact, impossible to dodge or deflect. 12. Vorthan vessels simply ceased to exist. Transformed into expanding clouds of plasma dot, the swarm's response was immediate and overwhelming. Billions of biomechanical fighters poured from their hive ships, a cloud of death that had consumed entire civilizations. The humans watched them come with what Thylos recognized as anticipation. This was what they had trained for, what their ancestors had dreamed of in their stories of alien invasion. The human fighters engaged the swarm in a dance of death that turned space into a shooting gallery. Where the Vorthans relied on overwhelming numbers, the humans used superior tactics and firepower. They created kill boxes, overlapping fields of fire that turned Vorthan numbers into a liability. The more densely packed the swarm became, the more effective human area denial weapons proved to be. But the true horror of human warfare was revealed when the Marines deployed. The Galactic Harmony had no concept of boarding actions or ground combat in the modern age. The humans had perfected both. Teams of powered armor-clad soldiers breached Vorthan hive ships, bringing the fight to an enemy that had never experienced invasion of their own territory. The Marines didn't just kill. They studied, analyzed, and adapted. Within hours, they had identified critical weaknesses in Vorthan biology. The swarm's hive mind, which had been their greatest strength, became a vulnerability. Human electronic warfare specialists introduced viruses into the Vorthan neural network, turning their own units against each other. The battle for Zephyria lasted 18 hours. In that time, humanity destroyed a force that had consumed dozens of civilizations. They didn't just defeat the Vorthons. They dismantled them, studying their technology and biology even as they annihilated them. When the last hive ship tried to flee, Admiral Chun ordered it captured intact. The humans wanted to study their enemy, to understand them completely, to ensure that nothing like them could ever threaten humanity again. The aftermath was almost as terrifying as the battle. Human medical teams deployed to Zephyrian colonies, bringing trauma care techniques developed in Earth's endless wars. Human engineers began fortifying Harmony, worlds with defensive systems that would have been considered acts of aggression before the Vorthon invasion. The peaceful species of the galaxy watched in awe and horror as humanity transformed their region of space into a fortress. But perhaps the most unsettling change was the human proposal for a new galactic order. General Harrison, now appointed as humanity's military liaison to the Galactic Harmony, presented a doctrine that he called peace through strength. The humans would provide military protection to Harmony species, maintaining a standing fleet to respond to any future threats. In exchange, they wanted resources, technology, and a voice in galactic governance. Some species saw this as salvation, a guarantee of protection from future threats. Others saw it as the beginning of a more subtle conquest. The humans weren't invading or demanding submission, but their very presence changed everything. Species that had evolved beyond violence now lived under the protection of the galaxy's most violent race. The peace they had maintained through enlightenment was now enforced by human weapons. Ambassador Thylos found himself in numerous meetings with human officials, trying to bridge the gap between two incompatible worldviews. The humans genuinely seemed to want to protect the Harmony species, but their methods were antithetical to everything the peaceful civilizations believed. They spoke of deterrence through fear, of maintaining peace by preparing for war, of concepts that the Harmony had abandoned millennia ago. The cultural exchange went both ways. Humans were fascinated by Harmony technology, particularly their advances in fields that Earth had neglected in favor of military development. Medical techniques that could extend life indefinitely, agricultural methods that could feed billions without ecological damage, energy systems that drew power from quantum fluctuations. The humans absorbed this knowledge with the same intensity. They had once applied to weapons development, yet even as they learned, they continued to build weapons. The Vorthon invasion had validated every paranoid assumption in human history. If one extragalactic threat could emerge, others might follow. Humanity began constructing defense stations at the galaxy's edge, early warning systems that could detect threats from the void. They developed weapons specifically designed to counter different theoretical enemies, from machine intelligences to psychic hive minds to things that existed partially in other dimensions, the Zephyrians and other. Harmony species watched this militarization with mixed feelings. They were grateful for the protection, but disturbed by the transformation of their peaceful galaxy into an armed camp. Human military advisors were assigned to each Harmony world, teaching basic defensive tactics to species that had forgotten how to fight. It was, as one human historian noted, like teaching sheep to behave like wolves while hoping they wouldn't develop a taste for meat. The controversy reached its peak when humanity proposed the construction of what they called a deterrent fleet. These would be automated weapons platforms, hidden throughout the galaxy, capable of delivering devastating retaliation against any aggressor, even if humanity itself was destroyed. The concept of mutual assured destruction, which had kept Earth from nuclear annihilation, would now be applied on a galactic scale. The vote was close, but the memory of the Vorthon invasion was fresh. The Harmony species agreed, though many did so with the feeling that they were trading one form of existential threat for another. The galaxy was safer, but also fundamentally changed. The age of pure peace was over, replaced by an armed peace. maintained by humanity's warrior children that, as Thylos stood in his office, looking out at the human defensive platforms now orbiting his world, he wondered what the future held. The humans had saved them, unquestionably. But they had also introduced something the Harmony had tried to evolve beyond. The capacity for violence, once awakened, was difficult to put back to sleep. The galaxy now had protectors, but those protectors were predators who had learned to live among prey. The final report he filed with the Galactic Archives contained a warning for future generations. The humans were not conquerors in the traditional sense, but their very presence was transformative. They brought safety through strength, peace through power, and protection through the promise of devastating retaliation against any threat. They were saviors and potential destroyers, guardians and barely leashed weapons. The galaxy had called for help, and the Deathworlders had answered. But every species knew that such help came with a price, even if that price wouldn't be clear. For generations to come, the humans had given them safety, but they had also given them something else, something that could never be taken back. They had reminded the galaxy that in the dark between the stars, there were things that could only be stopped by those willing to become monsters themselves. And so the galaxy entered a new age, protected by the children of Earth, the Deathworlders, who had turned their violent nature into a shield for those who could not protect themselves. It was safety, but it was safety with teeth, peace with claws, and harmony enforced by the promise of overwhelming violence against any who would disturb. The stars were safer now, but they would never be the same. Asterisk.